The visuals of passenger planes slicing through the twin towers of the World Trade Center are etched in public memory. Today marks 22 years since 9/11, the al-Qaeda-led terror attacks in New York City. On this day, 4 hijacked jetliners had crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania, killing nearly 3,000 people and changing the course of history over the next 2 decades. But even after more than 2 decades since that tragic attack, families and friends remembered those killed on hijacked Flight 93 in the Shanksville, Pennsylvania field where the plane ultimately crashed.
22 years ago today, when the United States was attacked, heroes emerged in New York, at the Pentagon, and aboard Flight 93. The 40 passengers and crew members of Flight 93 collectively stopped their hijacked plane from reaching its intended target. Their actions unquestionably saved untold number of lives and preserved the U.S. Capitol.
Passengers on United Airlines Flight 93 overcame the hijackers and the plane crashed in a farm field, preventing another target from being hit. It is believed the U.S. Capitol was the intended target the terrorists were aiming for when they hijacked the plane. Meanwhile, at Pentagon, a U.S. flag was unfurled on the side of the building to mark the 22nd anniversary of the September 11th attack.
Or the ramparts and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air.
Meanwhile, in New York, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris attended services at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum at the Ground Zero site in Lower Manhattan, New York City.
By the dawn's early light and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air.
In the early hours of Monday in New York, the bell of hope rang out at St. Paul's Chapel at around 8:46 local time. This was to mark the moment when the first of 2 planes hit the World Trade Center 22 years ago.
Thank you for coming once again to St. Paul's Chapel as we commemorate the lives of all those who were lost on 9/11. We thank you for being part of this celebration is the wrong word, this remembrance of the events of that day and all of those heroes who sacrificed the greatest sacrifice for this city.
The families who lost their loved ones say that it still feels like yesterday when the attack happened. Outside the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York, loved ones paid touching tributes to those they lost.
If it's 22 years and this is the way I still feel like yesterday, I can't tell you. It's hard. It's my second child. She's a darling of my eyes. She's everything and more.
Twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes.
The 9/11 attacks, which happened more than 2 decades ago, claimed nearly 3,000 lives, including more than 2,600 at the World Trade Center, 125 at the Pentagon, and around 265 on the 4 planes when commercial airliners crashed into the New York World Trade Center Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and after passengers mounted a counter-attack in Pennsylvania field. Now for more on this, we are being joined by our correspondent Susan Teherani live from New York. Susan, how are Americans commemorating this day?
Yeah, 22 years after, it's hard to imagine anyone not remembering where they were during that day. Americans are very reflective during this day. As you mentioned, the ceremonies are happening at the key sites on the one hand, but on the other hand, really 9/11 was the greatest day of service for Americans, as it's been called. So you have other events, notably here in New York, happening on the sidelines, volunteers putting together food for the homeless, people gathering at fire departments where they lost individuals, and also the police station as well. But it is a remembrance for those of us who were around and old enough to remember. But on the other hand, there is a generation that didn't see the events of 9/11 firsthand. For them, never forget really has another meaning to it. And then there are those that are reflecting on how much America changed in the past 22 years. You know, airport security changed, a lot of rules and regulations like the Patriot Act and surveillance came into effect. So, you know, this year there's a lot of reflection. Of course, 2 years ago, we saw Afghanistan fall once again into the hands of Taliban. That was very emotional. And I think a lot of foreign policy aspects will be discussed in the coming days and the next hours during Monday as well. And then reflecting, of course, on, you know, those tragic events that happened, notably for those who lost loved ones firsthand. So it's a very somber occasion. On the one hand, everyone's doing what they can, but on the other hand, you know, there's been this conversation about the challenge of remembering how important that day was for a generation that, again, really didn't see the effect firsthand of what happened 22 years ago.
Absolutely, Susan. If you could also tell us a little about who all are in attendance for the memorial event.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, Vice President Kamala Harris was here in New York, but you had other high-ranking officials like Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, Kristen Gillibrand as well, the New York mayor, former mayor Michael Bloomberg as well. But one Republican candidate who is the only veteran in the Republican field, Ron DeSantis, and his wife also came here in New York at the invitation of 6 families who had lost loved ones during those attacks. President Biden will be the first president to not be at any of the crash sites in the past 22 days. He'll be hundreds of miles away. He will deliver a speech in Anchorage, Alaska. Meanwhile, First Lady Jill Biden laid a wreath at the Pentagon Memorial, and First Gentleman, Kamala Harris's husband, was in Pennsylvania.
All right, Susan, thank you for getting us all those updates from New York.